Hello and welcome to the new episode of the Space Defense and Security Podcast by Axis Hub. So, the today's topic is the unknown men, spies and operations of R&AW. Of course, we are not speaking about Dhurandhar, if that's what people are expecting in today's episode, because previously we have recorded some episodes on Dhurandhar. In future also we have some guests coming, but today the topic is not more about the real life, but about the real life. And the guest speaker that we have today, he has previously been on the podcast. His episodes were highly, I would say, encouraged and listened by the people. There was a lot of demand as well, but of course, due to his busy schedule last year, we couldn't record a few more episodes. So yeah, now he's back again with his I would say bulked up new research. So Dheeraj, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Omkar. Actually, earlier this week, I was talking to a former intelligence officer. He had called me for something and he asked me what I was doing. And I
Yes.
told him that, I was writing a paper because I was invited by some organization to present a paper on Indian intelligence. And he said,
Yeah.
everybody seems to be having this intelligence fever nowadays. So I told him, yes, sir, it's like seasonal flu that comes once in a while. So the last time we spoke, it was a Durandar in Canada that had created
Yeah.
that fever. And this time
Yes.
it's Bollywood. But nevertheless, I think that these are important topics that we need to be discussing about. So I'm glad that you've invited
Yes.
me and I'm always happy to talk to you. So thank you very much.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's always pleasure to speak with you and learn a lot of things from you as well. A lot of new perspectives. I think just before our call as well, we had a brief conversation too. So directly jumping into the topic today, many people today talk about the unknown men who allegedly eliminated terrorists abroad, and specifically I would call out the name Pakistan, which is a neighboring country. From an intelligence and strategic perspective, who are these people really, and are they intelligence officers, special forces, assets, or is that a network built over decades? It can be basically anything. So we just need a kind of a good outlook on that issue. So yeah, the floor is to you.
Yeah, okay. So look, we are talking about events that have been happening in the recent past, right? So we don't have access to credible sources, right? I mean, there are no archival documents available. So it's very difficult to pinpoint and say who are these unknown men, right? So first and foremost, they could actually be people who are unknown, who have no connections whatsoever with intelligence
Yeah.
agencies, because we are essentially talking about criminal enterprises. We are talking about terrorist groups and terrorist organizations, and these are highly competitive spaces. So,
Yes.
and there are reasons for each one to bump off one another. So they could actually be internal rivalries for all we know. But if they're not, then if they are actually operations conducted by intelligence agencies, if they are covert actions, then they could be any of what you mentioned, right? Say it depends on the degree of deniability that the intelligence agencies or states want to maintain. Say, for example, if you take the killing of Osama bin Laden, they just wanted to maintain secrecy so long as the operation was over and the commandos got out of Pakistan. But after that, they were anyways going to own up the operation. So there, it was quite clear that there were special forces commandos from the United States who went and carried out the attack. There are other instances. For
Yes.
instance, if you take the assassination of some of the Russians who immigrated or defected to the UK or US, say, for example, the case of Litvinenko in 2006 or Sergei Skripal in 2018, where it was attempted but it was not successful. There, you actually have members from the Russian GRU or the Russian intelligence community come out and carry out these kind of attacks.
Okay.
The Israeli Mossad is also quite famous, or notorious for this. They send in their own operatives to carry out these liquidation programs and so on. But over the years, you also see that with the use of technology, there have been new means of carrying out the attacks where there's nobody pulling the trigger at all. For example, on 27 November 2020, you had the killing of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. That was the name of the Iranian nuclear scientist. I think he was the second most
Yeah.
protected person in Iran after the Ayatollah. So when he was killed, apparently there was nobody there to pull the trigger. It was a remote controlled machine gun, which is controlled from satellites and so on, AI powered. So there you had no human being at all. So there's no question of asking who was this unknown gunman, because there's no man there, right? And beyond all of this, if you look at what's happening in Pakistan, and if you assume that these attacks are carried out by the Indian intelligence, then, like as I was saying, there is this whole concept of crime, terror, nexus, and so on. So it creates opportunities for intelligence agencies to just hire a bunch of assassins, pay them off a certain amount of money, and get them to carry out these actions. So who exactly are these unknown gunmen? They could be any of all these men that I mentioned. They could be actual operatives of intelligence agencies. They could be hired assassins, they could just simply be
Yes.
intergroup rivalries with the intelligence agencies having nothing to do with them at all. So yeah, that's the long and short answer to your question.
Nice. And I was actually not aware about the Russia angle, especially that you mentioned. But yeah, thanks for that additional information as well. And going a step ahead, historically, India was known for, I would say, strategic, resistant, and diplomacy. Rather than just assassinations. I mean, like, it was previously it was just defensive. Now it is completely offensive. I think one of the Pakistani representative in the UN also mentioned this to Ajit Doval's strategy, that offensive defense strategy and the double squeeze won't work for India. But I think India went a lot, I think, strategically into those operations later on. But from a foreign policy and intelligence perspective, what has changed? And how did India move from strategic resistance to targeted killing as a counterterrorism tool? I mean, emotionally, I know this fact that, okay, we have been resisting a lot. But yeah, from a strategic and the tactical perspective, I would like to know what are your thoughts on this?
You see, Omkar, there's a saying about India that you say anything about India, it's true, and the opposite is equally true. And I think your question sort of resonates with that thought, uh, because it is not entirely true that India did not carry out targeted killings of terrorists as part of its counterterrorism policy. Because
Yeah.
if you take, for example, the Khalistan movement, right? The Punjab theater had seen a lot of violence, especially in the late 1980s and early 1990s.
Yes.
And under the leadership of Mr. KPS Gill, when the movement was put to an end, we did notice that the Punjab police had categorized terrorists into different categories. The most dreaded ones shortlisted for elimination, and the others shortlisted for sort of turning them around, or getting them to cooperate with the police and so on. And we see this kind of a practice in other theaters as well, in Kashmir or in the Northeast and so on. So targeted killing per se is not an idea that is alien to India's counterterrorism. But you're also right, because we did not extend this to state-sponsored terrorism. The kind of terrorism where terrorists enjoyed safe havens in foreign locations, right? So the moment it was beyond India's borders, we did have instances of, let's say, an odd cross-border raid or something. But this scale of targeted killing that we're seeing nowadays was something that is new. And I think the reason is because it's something that you also touched upon. Look, when you ask about what India's approach to counterterrorism ought to be, you will get different answers depending on who you're talking to, right? So one, there has been the intelligence point of view, because if you look at it historically, Indian intelligence agencies have understood Pakistan for what it is. They've not been guided by grand theories of international relations or grand idealist positions on what international politics need to look like and so on. So they have engaged themselves in
Yes.
studying this country for what it is and understanding its strategic culture. On the other hand, you have the politico diplomatic community, who come with their own ideas about how to change the world, how to manage this world, and so on, right? So, which is why you have
Yes.
you see, before 2014, you have slogans like Aman Ki Asha and so on and so forth, right? The hope for peace. So the
Yes.
Indian intelligence viewpoint is that this is a game that Pakistan is playing because it's part of its strategic culture, and it has to be responded in kind, because that's the only way that it can be deterred. Whereas the political diplomatic community, by and large, has believed that Pakistan can be engaged with, especially for post 2000, in between 2004 and 14, for those 10 years, you saw the Indian political leadership equate India and Pakistan and say that terrorism is a common problem between the two countries. Right? And today we know that that's kind of a ridiculous
Yes.
thing to say, but it was said at that point in time. So there were serious hopes that the two countries can coexist and fight out this common threat. But from 2014, what has happened is the new dispensation. I'm not sure. I mean, they do say that they are going to be tough on terrorism, but I haven't come across any credible strategy of their own. There's nothing called a BJP strategy against terrorism. So I think that they have, by elevating Mr. Ajit Doval as the National Security Advisor, there seems to be a willingness to listen to the intelligence point of view. And as I was explaining all this while, the intelligence point of view is that Pakistan has to be spoken to in a language that it understands. So from that, if you look at India's counterterrorism from that point of view, I think that it makes sense to attack the problem at its root. And if the roots of the problem are in Pakistan, if the
Yes.
roots of the problem are in safe havens elsewhere, so it makes sense to then target them where they are, right? Rather than, wait for the attacks to happen and then presenting your
Yes.
dossiers and so on. And I think that that change is something that is not just evident, but is also established because if you look at the recent counterterrorism strategy document that the Indian government has put out, which is quite a present change, I must say, because India always refrains from putting out anything in print.
Yes.
But this counterterrorism document, which is known as Prahar, um, it clearly shows that India is moving from a response-oriented approach to counterterrorism towards a more proactive approach, that is prevention-oriented approach.
Yes.
So when you're talking about a prevention-oriented approach, then there are any number of reasons to ensure that those people who are planning terrorist attacks or who are terrorist leaders deserve to be eliminated, right? So that is the change that has come about in the last 10 to 12 years. Yes, so I'll stop there and wait for the we can continue the discussion here.
No, absolutely. I think this is a nice point. I think you have mentioned. I have little bit, off the topic of what we are discussed. I mean, just from a civilian perspective, I want to know your thought. So, I was working as a journalist in, previously before coming here to France, and of course, as a journalist, you have like several kind of assignments. Like you don't only get when you're reporting on the ground, you don't only get assignments which are related to maybe business tech that I was to primarily do, but anything and everything. So at that time, I was not so much into the depths of what the intelligence are, but a fairly rough idea I'd had with my brief engagement with, I think, ORF and all. I think they used to have some events, so I was involved through one of my contractors in that assignment. And briefly, like some of our team members were discussing that they had presented a report where they showcase that the amount of infiltration in India that is there, it's something that you can't even catch it. And specifically, I think Pune was one of the locations that was caught in that. And fast forward to like 6 7 years ahead, when I left India, came here, and we saw the Kurulkar's case basically happening. That was literally very local. I mean, like as a student of Ferguson College and as well as engaged in some of the assignments related to journalism or technical writing in the defense, I had visited that institute. I had seen that basically, and I couldn't basically imagine that what I experienced or the findings that were mentioned in that report like 6 7 years ago was basically true. So, from a civilian perspective, how do you see this scenario basically in general? Are there any strategies being implemented, or do you think that in future India should take care of this? Because this is one of the reason I observed in the space domain as well. The ISRO people are extremely protected in India, not because they are like very high level scientists, but primarily because a lot of our scientists have died under mysterious circumstances in India. And of course, the reasons and the examples and everything points out towards the infiltration of the foreign agencies. So just want to know the thoughts of yours, because I think the kind of answer that you gave was really nice. So I thought I'll just basically put out this as well to you in general, if you would like
Yeah,
to put out
yeah,
any thoughts on this.
yeah. This does not connect to the topic at hand, but I think that it is an important question. It's an
Yeah, yeah.
important point as well because you see, Indians are not very security conscious, right? Even for example, we're talking about counterterrorism. We're talking about whether India should
That's a good
have
point, by
should.
the way. Sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt. That's a really good point. Indians are not security conscious. That's a really good point. I'm going
Absolutely.
to highlight this. But yeah, yeah. I really agree with you. But yeah, proceed. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
Yeah, no worries. Now, what I was trying to say is that
Yeah.
if you talk to an average Indian, they really, and you get into discussions around, terrorism, the 2008 Mumbai attacks, and so on. There is anger. There's always anger among, within an average Indian, but that somehow did not translate to policy. That goes on to show that foreign policy, national security policies are an elite endeavor in India. Then it's not something that flows from the grassroots. It's only recently that we've seen that even offensive counterterrorism can be converted into electoral gains and people can be mobilized and so on and so forth, right? So we really, Indians
Yeah.
don't really have that kind of understanding of what national security is. How do we need to be protective of some of our secrets and so on and so forth, right? And the scale of the problem that you mentioned, right? Because India is a vast country and there are umpteen opportunities for enemy agencies, enemy intelligence agencies to
Yes.
infiltrate the society to do a whole bunch of things. And you have one intelligence agency called the Intelligence Bureau, which is the premier counterintelligence agency.
Yes.
This agency itself suffers from serious manpower issues, issues of priorities, and so on and so forth. So the exact extent to which the bureau can be trusted to cover all the kind of threats that enemy agencies pose is something that requires a wider discussion. Because in the grand scheme of things, they have done really well. Given the limited resources, they have done quite a lot to protect the country. But
Yes.
it requires efforts from many more agencies, many more individuals from the private sector, and a whole bunch of things, right? So, until unless that kind of a participation, a collaboration does not happen, and in order for that to happen, there has to be fundamental changes, like at the level of just embracing a degree of security consciousness, knowing that what I have is worthy of being protected, right? That is missing in India, right? So because that is missing, there are any number of
Absolutely.
opportunities for foreign agencies to get hold of secrets in India. But like I said, this is a topic for a much wider discussion because we'll be going into different tangents. There is the
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
cyber
Yeah.
aspect, there is
Yes.
the
Yes. Yes.
academic aspect, education
True.
aspect, and so
True.
on.
No, no, thank you for quickly just wrapping on this around as well. I think it was very important, especially the point that you mentioned related to policy, because I personally work on the NATO policies and all, and I see that over here the things are very different. In France, especially, I see the anger of the people translates to the policy. In India, the anger remains until concentrated only to the films or the festivals max. It doesn't basically go beyond that into some actionable insights, and I think that's an issue. But yeah, as you said, like, this is a topic for different discussion. I'll move on to our further questions. uh, so yeah, without discussing any classified details, can you explain how covert operations like targeted killings or sabotage operations are generally planned and executed? And from your perspective and your experience, what kind of intelligence preparation and networks are required uh, before such operations even become possible in reality?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say there is much classified about this, because what remains classified is details about individual operations. But otherwise, the theories of conducting these operations, the methodologies, and so on, they're quite open. They're quite an open secret. Because if you're talking about killing enemies, liquidation of your enemies, it goes back to the time of Kautilya. Kautilya, if you read the Arthashastra, there is a mention of, I don't know, I think about 30 different kinds of poisons that can be induced into the human body to kill someone. We came up with the concepts of Vishakanya and so, which is not there in the Arthashastra, but the concept itself, the idea itself is something that's not alien to most Indians, right? So at a conceptual level, it is something that's well absorbed, right? But you're right in asking this question because in order to plan an operation, in order to plan a single operation to kill somebody, to target somebody, to target a terrorist in this instance, it takes several months. It's not a straightforward event, right? First and foremost, you will need to pick the right target and get the clearance from the those in authority to provide the authorization and so on, right? So some in many instances, if it is going to have serious ramifications, then the authorization might have to come from the highest office of the country, maybe the prime minister, the president, right? Otherwise, it can be dealt with, at the level of the organizational leadership itself. So picking the right target becomes very important. And picking of the target itself, when I say it becomes important, it's also because what you wish to achieve. And I don't want to dwell too much into this because I think we can discuss that, in the future. But the whole idea is that choosing the target must have a strategic goal. It must have some intention behind the choice of the target. And once the target is chosen, the next step is you need to have a good profiler that who can build a profile of this individual, right? What are their daily routines like? What are their likes and dislikes? Where are they going? Who are they meeting? And so on and so forth, right? Now, this might seem pretty straightforward, but trust me, these are people who know that they will be targeted at some point, so they don't stick to routines, right? So you and I, we get up in the morning, we go to work, we take the same bus, we take the same mode of transport, we take the same routes. We have no reason to keep changing it
Yes.
every day, right? We have no reason to worry about who we are meeting on a day-to-day basis. But these
Yes,
are
yes,
guys who know that they are likely to be targeted at some
yes,
point. So they take a lot of measures to make sure that there is no sense of predictability in what they do. So, so that kind of you need to have those kind of sources which can both technical and human that can give you that kind of information where you can build a good profile of
yes,
the individual that you need to target. And then once you have the profile, the next question is what kind of methods do you wish to use to kill this person, right? So is it a
yes.
bomb attack? Many times what could happen was you can carry out a bomb attack, but there's no guarantee that
True.
your target will be killed. While on the other hand, you might end up killing many more people who are not the intended targets, right? So is it that you want to, do you want the target to be shot or do
Yes,
you want the target to be poisoned? If poisoned, then is it through injections or inhalation or what, right? So these are questions that come into play. And once you have made such decisions, you also need to think
yes,
about infiltration and exfiltration, right? So if you're sending in your own agents to carry out or operatives to carry out the attack,
yes,
then you must think about how to get them into the target location. And then once the operation is complete, how do you then exfiltrate them without really having
yes,
them caught, right? So if you can think about the 2010 attack that the Israeli Mossad carried out in Dubai to target Hamas leader, uh, the they failed in the sense that they ended up killing this individual, but the
yes,
entire Mossad team was sort of caught on camera because they didn't undertake certain security measures. They used passports, which were some of them were
measures.
repeated,
Yeah, yeah.
and the hotel where they targeted the individual had CCTV cameras everywhere, so all of their faces were recorded. In fact, there was one Mossad operative who sort of stared directly into the camera. So these kind of things can happen. So you need to think about exfiltration as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so and also
Yes,
you will
yes,
also have to plan for contingencies. If things go wrong, then where do these operatives go? Do you
yeah,
have safe houses? And what are the communication procedure, methods that you have in place, encrypted communication, so that you can these tactical communications should not be intercepted, and so on and so forth. And so once you have all of this in place, you still have one final step, which is you need to be able to rehearse before you actually go and perform, right? So it's just like enacting a drama. So you rehearse as many
yes,
times as possible, and the rehearsal also requires that you recreate your operational environment. So, for example, back in the day, if India wanted to infiltrate one of its operatives into, let's say, Karachi or some part of Pakistan, so how do you then recreate an environment like that? So, probably Old Delhi was the best place, right? Old Delhi also offers a similar operating environment. So
Yeah.
if you can run your trial runs there, make sure that you're not caught, make sure that you take into consideration all the contingencies that could come up, and then prepare for such eventualities.
Yes.
So yeah, so it is a long process, right? So from identifying the target to conducting all these
Absolutely.
rehearsals and then infiltrating the teams and then exfiltrating them and managing strategic communications after that, depending on how the operation goes. So all of these things need to go into play, right? So which is why I say that it's just not just about hiring somebody to kill. If that's the case, then that's fine. If you only need to make sure that
Yes.
the financial flows are not retraceable back to you, right? So if you can just simply manage that,
Yes.
then the you have a very high degree of deniability, so you don't have to be concerned. But if you're going to send in your own operatives, then it requires more careful and meticulous planning.
Absolutely. And just, I would say this is a kind of, adding a layer onto what I just asked. So, I believe intelligence agencies around the world often work through proxies and local assets, or maybe criminal networks as well, in the hostile territories. And how important are such networks in covert operations, especially in countries where official presence is impossible? I mean, close to impossible sometimes. I have heard stories of the people whom I cannot mention the name, of course, on the podcast, who were a part of the families who went as a part of the Indian delegation to Islamabad. We had like High Commission over there. I don't know whether it's still operating though, because it's a long time back, and they have had experience that like people are following them. Things are primarily happening in a way that because I think embassies are generally used as a kind of a deep cover as well for some of the agency operations as well. So in country like Pakistan, which is like most of our India security budget goes on that, how do you basically carry out covert operations by having an official presence there?
Well, you are right about both these things. One being that most intelligence agencies tend to adopt diplomatic covers, right? The embassies are the basis of intelligence operations, where you have intelligence officers posted on diplomatic covers, and quite naturally,
Yeah.
because if you're caught, then you have the Geneva Convention to protect you. You're only declared persona non grata and sent back, right? So you have diplomatic immunity. You cannot be arrested. You cannot be mistreated. But obviously, Pakistan does not adhere to all these kind of conventions. And to be honest, even India doesn't. The IB doesn't give a very good time to Pakistani intelligence officers or diplomats posted in Delhi. So it's kind of mutual, though I wouldn't say that
Yeah.
they're as bad as how Pakistan treats Indian diplomats. So you see,
Yeah.
there are two factors here, right? Firstly, as you mentioned, it's about diplomatic presence, right? Over the years, what we have seen, if, for example, let's take the Russia-Ukraine war. What happened as the Russia-Ukraine war was beginning? You had all the Russian diplomats being expelled from European countries, from North American countries, and so on. So, in one go, Russia has lost its presence in these countries. There are no more diplomats here. So, conducting intelligence activities from
Yes.
the Russian embassy becomes very difficult. So, what do you do in that instance? So, then you reach out to anybody possible, right? And that's where this nexus builds with criminal organizations or other kind of private individuals, right? So, you are right to that extent when you say that lack of presence then leads to these kind of nexus building up. But then there's a second factor. These are state to state problems that we're talking about. But when you're talking about counterterrorism, you're talking about terrorist organizations. They, it's very difficult to monitor them being based in an embassy, right, or in a high commission. And terrorist groups, per se, they are very hierarchical and close knit groups, right? So even infiltrating a terrorist group becomes extremely, extremely difficult. Yeah, you can manage to plant a spy in another country's embassy. There's so many embassy staff and so on. But infiltrating a terrorist group becomes highly difficult, and even if you manage to do so, communication becomes even more difficult, right? And terrorist groups are, they're just groups with certain political agendas. So what is Al Qaeda fighting for? They're fighting for the establishment of an Islamic State, and same goes with ISIS or any other organization. Beyond that kind of a political agenda, the will to carry out that, to fight for that political agenda, they don't really have the operational and logistical support necessary to carry out terrorist attacks, to sustain themselves. And so what they do is they build ties with criminal organizations. Now, when you're talking about organized criminal groups, they are transnational in character. So they have infrastructure cutting across borders, they have manpower, they have financial networks, and so on and so forth, which the terrorist groups, then intend to exploit. And that's why you have this term called crime terror nexus. And this crime terror nexus, as much as it is operationally useful for terrorist groups, it's also useful, it presents useful opportunity for intelligence agencies. Because the intelligence agencies cannot infiltrate the terrorist groups by themselves, now they see an opportunity with these criminal gangs. Now, as I was already telling you, this is a competitive space where murder for hire, or is quite par for the course. Nobody's going to be talking about it's not going to raise suspicions that one gang member bumped off another gang member, right? So that creates opportunities for intelligence agencies as well. So that is why when you're talking about crime terror nexus, the larger picture shows you that it is crime terror intelligence nexus. So that's the second reason why you see these kind of collaborations and having proxies and so on. And the third thing today is that with the emergence of round the clock surveillance technologies and the coming of internet, where it is very difficult to create a myth or a cover. It's not entirely impossible, but it's difficult. So in this day and age, it's far more easier to hire somebody to carry out an odd attack rather than going through this lengthy and tedious procedure of adopting a cover, infiltrating yourself into an enemy country, making it all the way to where a terrorist organization is based out, and then so it makes life more difficult. And also one of the things that I forgot to mention when you asked me about the operational steps that need to be taken while planning, is that even after you've done everything, right, you've rehearsed your operations and so on, there is no guarantee that on the final day your target will be where you expect him or her to be, right? So until the last moment,
Yes,
you need to be sure whether they're there or
that is
not,
for
right?
sure.
So till the last moment, there's so much that goes into it, and so it doesn't really make much sense to have one of our own, operative to go in and carry out an attack if it is much
Very
more
true.
easier to simply hire somebody and pay them off to get the job done. So which is why you see from both an operational point of view and also just the way the nature of intelligence business is changing, you see a lot of these proxies, not proxies, but collaborations with criminal groups, organized criminal groups, and intelligence agencies and terrorist groups developing. So
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that is very true. The one that you mentioned about the final target, you won't find him there or her, maybe uh, that, like, the uncertainty always looms in the operation. That's what I also believe, that looking at all the research, I think uncertainty is a factor. Like, in I think the space industry, we say while launching the satellites, the uncertainty always looms in whether the satellite will explode or not. So, so I think it's the same for the intelligence operations as well. Yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
So, moving ahead, I think on the targeted killings, yeah, I think the targeted killings and covert operations mainly about revenge, deterrence, disruption of networks, or sending a strategic signal to adversaries. Uh, because what is the real objective from a national security and intelligence perspective? As I said previously, that I mean, yes, there is an emotional angle as well, but from a strategic perspective, is the story just that uh, we have tracked now and let's eliminate them, or what is the prime objective? Because I believe a lot of terrorists still are freeing, I mean, roaming around very free in the world. Why haven't we adopted this strategy previously? So yeah, on to you again.
Yeah. Look, Omkar, when you talk about a terrorist attack and a targeted killing, you can look at them as two sides of the same coin in the sense that they are both propaganda by the deed, right? So a terrorist attack, by the attack itself is trying to communicate something, and a targeted killing is also trying to communicate something. So that needs to be supplemented by some form of strategic communications, which both terrorist organizations as well as, in the instance of a targeted killing carried out by a state or its intelligence agencies, they need to be able to communicate that, right? So, for example, if you, I think it was 1987 or 1988, one of these years, when there were four Russian diplomats who were kidnapped in Lebanon, and uh, one of them was eventually killed, and the Russians were wanting the other three to be released. So the moment one of the diplomat was killed, um, what the Russian KGB did was they picked up a family member of Hezbollah and they sort of castrated him and they parceled the organ to Hezbollah, saying that, if you don't release the other three people, other three diplomats, then more's going to follow, right? So there was communication. So ever since, Hezbollah has not
Okay.
troubled the Russians at all, right? So you see, so it is to say that we are
Yes.
capable of more violence than you are, right? So that was the message in that instance.
Yes.
But over the years, if you see, the Israelis have been carrying out a lot of targeted killings of terrorists, both in Gaza, across the world, and so on.
Yes.
And if I have to sit here and speak as an academic, I have read a lot of academic work on this topic, on the topic of targeted killings and assassinations and so on. And to be honest, Omkar, there is really no credible answer to this question of whether it works or so on, because every article that I read is clearly a representation of the author's, predetermined opinion or, bias and so on and so forth. So it's quite difficult. It's quite
Yes.
difficult whether it's a quantitative study or a qualitative study. It is quite difficult to say whether these kind of killings actually work and or not, right? So, but there are some findings that I think that are uniform, and that tells you what kind of communications the states are trying to do, right? So, the first and foremost question is, who are you targeting in this hierarchy, and what do you wish to achieve by it? Right? So many a times, what happens is
Yes.
states tend to carry out targeted killings of terrorist groups' leaders if they sort of feel that the next person who's going to take the position is in some ways more favorable to them than, let's say, the one who's there presently, right? So if the incumbent terrorist group leader is somebody who's more prone to violence, whereas there
Yes.
is an understanding, there is an assessment conducted by the intelligence agency that says that his successor is more likely to be less poised towards violence, then I think then that decision, it makes that decision that much more easy, right? Or it could be carrying out targeted killings of mid-level leaders, right? Because as I was saying, the senior leadership of the terrorist groups are ones who are charismatic. They're more involved, they're immersed in the idea of fulfilling their strategic goals and so on. But in order to carry out a terrorist attack, it's usually the mid-level people who bring in specialized skills, who bring in, they are required, they're needed in terms of carrying out a terrorist attack. So if the intelligence agencies assess that by neutralizing these targets, then it's going to have, significantly dent the ability of the terrorist groups to carry out their attacks. Then they could carry out those kind of terrorist attacks. Sometimes it could simply be
Yes.
revenge because the intelligence agencies and security forces are suffering from weaknesses in the morale following a suicide bombing or something like that. So in that instance, they might carry out targeted killings only for the sake of revenge and so on. So again, there are a whole gamut of objectives that the states intend to achieve by carrying out these attacks. But what I think when I look at India's practices in the recent times is that this is where India has failed, because uh, by carrying out these terrorist attacks, so I was telling you that a terrorist attack is propaganda by the deed, right? And so is a targeted killing. So when you
Yes.
talk about propaganda, propaganda has to necessarily talk to three different kinds of audiences, right? It has to talk to your domestic audience. It has to talk to the adversaries audience, that is the terrorist groups themselves or the people who are supporting the terrorist groups. And it has to communicate with the international audience as well. The international community also needs to know something. So think of Al Qaeda carrying out a terrorist attack today. It is communicating and saying something to its core supporters that look, we're committed to this cause, so come and join us or whatever, right? That could be the kind of communication that they're trying to make with their
Yes.
supporters. For the adversary, they're trying to send out a different message that, you're not safe, and as long
Message.
as,
Yeah.
we don't achieve what we wish to achieve, we are going to be conducting these kind of attacks in the future as well. Let's say that's the message that they want to send out. And to the international community, they might be saying that, this country is not safe, don't invest here, and we will not stop until and unless our objectives are achieved, whatever, right? So you're sending out three different kinds of messages to three different sets of audiences. And that is why following an attack, you see the terrorist groups take credit for what they've done. You see a lot of chatter happening on social
Yes.
media or in their, encrypted communications and so on and so forth, right? Now, think about what happens with targeted killings, right? Uh, so in let's say in the 1980s, there was a man called Abu Jihad who was the second in line to Yasser Arafat, right? So when he was killed, um, the Israeli political leadership saw that the morale was really high. The Israeli people were quite supportive of. I mean, they didn't own it up that they had carried out the attack, but nevertheless, the Israeli people were now very exuberant about the fact that this man is no more there and so on, right? So there was a kind of message sent to them, and to the adversary quite clearly that you're not safe. You're going to be targeting you wherever you are and all that. But you need to have a message sent to the international audience as well. Now, in the case of Israel, what happens is it has been relying extensively on the historical baggage that the world carries, right? Especially of the Holocaust, that the world could not save the Jews when there was this Holocaust happening. So that in itself acts as a good, um, communicative strategy for Israel. Now, India does not enjoy that, right? So you saw that the moment there were some allegations raised about India's targeted killings in, let's say, Canada or an attempted one in the United States, there was zero international sympathy for India because the world does not understand India's terrorism problem, right? So even as India conducts these kind of targeted killings, which is sending a good message to the terrorist groups that they are not safe wherever they are, I think that much of the investment has gone into communications with the domestic audience. This whole slogan hearing of "Ghar mein घुस के मारेंगे," right? That's the opposite of "Aman ki Asha." So this communicates with the domestic audience.
Yes.
But whereas when it comes to the international audience, there hasn't been much communication happening. So I think that despite the fact that the act itself has a propaganda value, it has a communicative value, you need to have other forms of communication that surround it, right? So, and that helps especially when operations don't succeed or operations go haywire, and if you want to minimize the ramifications of
Yes.
those revelations and so on. So, yes, communications is an important part of targeted killings, just as it is with terrorism.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, it's all about narrative. I think, as former R&AW chief Vikram Sood says, the narrative is going to basically win you or basically break you as well if you don't basically set the line the way it needs to be. And yeah, just to add, maybe this might be a little bit bold statement from my end. Yeah, the world doesn't understand the India's terrorism problem. I agree with this thing, but a lot of times I have seen, especially here in France, they do not understand until the same people start attacking them. Like France's policy towards Pakistan significantly changed after 2015 of the the attack that happened in Paris Stadium. Uh, but of course, due to the alignment towards NATO and related things, there are of course some exchanges that is happening, but it has significantly reduced since that time. And I think we are seeing a different perspective towards that. So I think of course, but India is responsible for the narrative building. So I think we need to build the narrative the way it needs to be, the way it will be heard by the people at the end of the day. And I agree with you with this fact. I think, except few Sikh communities all across, maybe few in few places in UK or Canada or US, none were basically, there was no such visibility for the India's voice against what had happened in Canada. Basically, I think a lot of embassies were also at stake at that time of India. So yeah,
No, the
that's I just
Europe.
wanted to make a point on that.
You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
I'll just add a
yeah.
little bit
Proceed,
to what you're
yeah.
saying. Uh, the problem for Europe is that they don't have a neighboring country that sponsors terrorism. So you see, for many of the European countries, the
Absolutely.
2015 attack that you mentioned, right? You're talking about an attack carried out by a group called the Islamic State. Now, this is a non-state actor. What the problem that India faces is that it has a state that sponsors it sponsors terror, and it uses proxies, which are, so if you look at the Lashkar-e-Taiba, it is not a non-state organization like the Islamic State, right? Lashkar-e-Taiba is nothing but an informal wing of the Pakistani military, right? It is in a manner of speaking it is a special force of the Pakistani military, though there might be some special force officers in India or elsewhere who might be hurt by the statement, but from clearly the character
Yes.
is somewhat similar, right? If you look at the 26/11 attack, for example, what makes 26/11 as an attack stand differently from
Yes.
any other terrorist attack that's happened in the world is that you had real time command and control and you saw guidance coming from Pakistan even as the attack was going on. Now tell me one other terrorist attack when this was happening, when you see something similar like this. It's very difficult to pull off something like this, right? But the Indian, I think, I don't know who to blame for this, but maybe the Indian diaspora can take it up. The Indian government needs to do much more. Indian academics need to do much more in terms of informing the world about what exactly is India's problem. I mean, you're an Indian, I don't want to put you in a spot, but if I had to ask you, now that you know that Hardeep Singh Nijjar was gunned down in Canada and Pannun was sort of targeted in the United States, if you leave these two names aside, can you name me one Khalistani terrorist? If Indians we don't know it, then how do we
Bhinderwala, I
expect any
think
sympathy
that's the
from the West,
yeah.
from
That's the only
outsiders,
yeah.
right?
Few of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. True,
So
true.
point being
I
that
agree. I
in
agree with
in
you.
in
Yes.
peacetime, so what happens when things go wrong, right? Let's say there is some neutral journalist in the Western media who wants to pick up a book and understand the Khalistani problem. What is this problem? Who are these characters? Why is the Indian government doing what they're doing? They have nothing. And if they want to reach out to academics, they have none to reach out to. Yeah, so we need to so there is this wide gap in academia. There's this wide gap that is waiting to be filled, but we really don't have that kind of scholarship coming to fill this gap. And the Indian government also isn't doing much. So yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I hope, I think things change on this side. The narrative building is important for sure. I think we are almost at the final part of the episode. So, I mean, this is the last question is related to primarily, I would say, profile, psychology, and all. So, the people who carry out such operations, the kind of the one we just discussed right now, involving anyone and anything from local assets to maybe, someone else also, remain like unknown, unrecognized, and sometimes even disowned by, if captured by their own agencies. So, from your understanding of intelligence services, what kind of personality, mindset, and psychological profile is required for someone to operate in this world the way, uh, you know, especially in the hostile territories?
Well, you see, if you go the Russian way, right? The Russian KGB had something. They had an acronym that was called MICE, MIC, to say that these are the four motivations for anybody to spy on your behalf, to inform you, to betray their own people. And M was money, I was ideology, C is that you coerce them, you have something against them, so you blackmail them, and then you coerce them into sharing the information. And E is ego. We're all human beings. We have some kind of
Yeah,
ego that is bruised at some point. So if you can massage that well enough, then we'll share information. So, but then
yeah,
gradually we realize that whatever be the human motivation to commit an act of treason, or in this instance, you're talking about killings, targeted killings, right? It's not in anybody. I mean, we are not born killers, right? Not all of us are capable of killing somebody. It's you need to
yes,
cross a threshold that none of us have even sat and imagined that we have, right? But there are killings happening in the world. There are murders happening every day. It might be a spur of the moment or whatever, right? But here we are talking about the mindset of people who do this as a profession, correct? So here what happens is it's not sufficient to look at things like mice, but it's a question about how do you keep the individual motivated enough, to perform these kind of actions over a long period of time. And I think for that, there has to be multiple things, right? So, firstly, a sense of identity. So if you look at, I mean, Ronan Bergman has written an excellent book on this topic when it comes to Israeli assassinations, and the title of the book is "Rise and Kill First." And they say that this is something. This is an idea that's originated from their history, where they say that before somebody kills you, you just rise up and kill them first, right? So that kind of a mindset, right? So if at all you've been having only pacifist ideas, then it's quite difficult. So, which is why you will see that people who are picked up, say, for example, since you didn't want to refer to that movie, but if we have to revisit Durandar, you will see that it was a criminal who was picked up and who was sent in, right? I mean, not a criminal, but he had a criminal case against them and so on, right? So you need some kind of ignition to get the person to do something. It could be patriotism, it could be ideas like this or whatever. But what matters is the kind of relationship that the handling officer shares with the assets, with the agents, right? So they are the ones to keep them motivated. They are the ones to ensure that the psychological profile of these individuals who've gone into enemy territory is still maintained. Yeah, but if it is murder for hire, if you're just paid out to somebody, then you don't really need to think about all these things, right? So it's in very few cases that you have operatives go in and then carry out these kind of attacks. So, say for example, in 1996 there was an Israeli operation against a man called Khalid Mashal, who's still alive today. He's a Hamas commander. So they got to him.
Okay.
So to cut a long story short, basically what they wanted to do was they wanted to spray poison on his neck and then get him killed. But some things went wrong, and they sprayed the poison, and instead of spraying it on his neck, they sprayed it on his ear, and eventually he was hospitalized. But because the operation didn't go as planned, the two Mossad operatives who had gone to carry out this operation, they were caught. They were chased down by another Hamas operative, and they were caught and so on. And this operation happened in Jordan, and the Jordanian king was quite upset, and he was asking the then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to send in the antidote, and Netanyahu was refusing. And then they had to reach out to the American president. Bill Clinton also intervened, but nothing was happening. But when Netanyahu realized that these two men were caught, he wanted them to be released. So that's when they sent the antidote. They administered the antidote, and when Khalid Mashal was revived, these two men were sort of released. So so they respected their agents to the extent that they didn't want them to be caught. They didn't want it to undergo whatever they undergo, right? But imagine if it was just a petty criminal who was paid off,
Yes.
then would they go to that extent to get them exfiltrated? Because this petty criminal has no information about who gave him money or who tasked him to carry out this operation and so on and so forth. So there are several motivations to protect individuals as well, and that is a problem. So this also ties into the discussion around the ethics of intelligence, right? How ethical it is to abandon somebody after they have served very well, who have it's not even sacrifice is also a very small word, when you think about the kind of things that the devotion that they bring to the table. Say, even for example, if you think about have you watched the movie Razi? The woman who went to Pakistan and spied on behalf of India, and she gave us vital information that
Yes.
helped us in the 1971
Yeah.
war.
Yeah.
I can
Yes.
tell
Yes.
it to you on
Yeah.
record that she was a real person. It is not a cooked up story. I've heard these stories from former officers who had served at that
Yes.
point
Yes.
in time.
Yeah.
They had to, and more than the kind of
Yeah.
contributions they made, I think these officers that I have interacted with, they're more proud of the fact, and they're also, they're happy about the fact that she was exfiltrated, and they always say that the exfiltration was very difficult and so on. It goes on to show that they did value her life. They were willing to go to any extents to get her exfiltrated out of Pakistan. But again, there are exceptions. There are so many
Yes.
such cases of people who are languishing in Pakistani prisons and so on. But yeah, so It is a difficult question to answer. So I think that in terms of targeted killings, it is easier to simply hire criminals, pay other criminals to carry out these attacks, so that then at least the conscience of these intelligence officers is clear, if at all there is one.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you mentioned about some of the people, are still in the prison. I think someone from Ravindra Kaushik's family recently did a podcast with, I think, Sipsankar Pandit. I think
Okay.
he was, I think, he's also runs a podcast. I think, a very famous guy actually, and I mean, like they're expressing a lot actually about what has been through him, and I think, of course, but I personally don't know the details of the kind of operations that Ravindra Kaushik actually had gone through, but I just know this one fact that he never basically opened up
Right. You
in
see,
general in the
it's
prison.
an
That's
important point
that's
that you're
what I know. I
making,
think that's what his family. Yeah,
Yeah, so sorry to have
yeah,
cut you off, because I think
yes, yes,
that this ties to the reputation that the intelligence agencies then get, right? Now, if you go back to the 1960s, I'll tell you what happened with the Mossad, right? So you must be knowing about the instance of Adolf Eichmann being caught in Argentina and then being brought to Israel, tried and then hanged and so on, right? So there was this fear among many surviving Nazi officers that the Mossad would get to them at some point. So there was this reputation already built that Mossad is there, it's out there, it's this offensive organization, believes in kinetic operations, it is out there to neutralize former Nazi
yes,
operatives. At that point, what the one of the problems that Israel was facing was that the Egyptians were working on a missile program that could have obliterated Israel, if it was successful. And to the horror of the Israelis, they learned that many of the scientists who were working in the Egyptian missile program were Germans, were former Nazi members, were Germans. So what the Israelis did was, instead
okay,
of going out and neutralizing all of them, they reached out to a man called Otto Skorzeny. He is a former SS member. And they promised him that we will protect your life, we will not kill you if you work with us and help us sort of put an end to this program here. Right? So, with his help, they put an end to the German support of the German scientists' support of the Egyptian missile program without actually killing many people, right? So uh, that reputation really mattered there,
yes,
right? In Otto Skorzeny case, the reputation of Mossad being this agency that is capable of neutralizing its targets, it helped in some ways. It helped in even carrying out operations without killing anyone, right? Now, if you think about the instance that you mentioned, if let's say the Indian intelligence or any other intelligence
absolutely,
agency repeatedly gets this reputation of being an agency that does not watch out for its operatives or does not care for its assets, then what is that reputation going to do in the long run? How is it going to affect its human intelligence operations, its covert actions and so on? That is something for these agencies to think about. And I think in that case, where Indian intelligence suffers is that it does not have an institutional memory of its own. And that again ties to its recruitment policies and so on. If I talk about that, it'll take a really long time. But it's the fact of the matter is that
yeah, yeah.
an Indian intelligence officer, today has very little avenues to learn about his or her own organization, the kind of operations that were conducted, what were the challenges that came up, why is it necessary to have a long-term relationship with your assets and so on and so forth, right? So these are things that are absent in the Indian intelligence culture, but they are very important ones as you've been trying to
Yes,
flag.
absolutely. I think at this point, I think we had discussed in our previous episodes, which was like almost like 1.5 year ago. I think about the institutional memory, especially. I think we had discussed this in the episode. It was a two-part about the recruitment of the intelligence officers. We had extended. I think I'll add the link of that episodes as well here in the description section, so that everyone can from the audience can watch those of what Dheeraj is saying. You can watch it in an extended manner in his other episodes that we recorded. So yeah, I think it was overall a great session, Dheeraj. I believe we have covered most of the part. A lot of things actually popped up in between. So I'm happy to do more podcast actually episodes with you later in the coming months for sure. And as usual, thank you very much for giving us your time. It was great speaking with you, and I hope we keep on meeting like this again and again, someday in person as well, either in India or in Europe.
Thank you, Omkar. Thank you so much. It was
So yeah,
my pleasure to be on your show, really. And I will indeed look forward to many more
yes,
conversations in the future.
absolutely. Thank you very much.